Alrighty, so here we are, the first Sunday of the new year, and it's a time that we mark for new beginnings. Now, it's important to recognize that new beginnings are occurring every moment of every day, wherever we are, that this decision to mark January the 1st as the beginning of the new year is kind of an arbitrary one. Other cultures other cultures recognize, the beginning of the new year at other times. So you'll hear, I think it's sometime in February will be Chinese New Year, and sometime in September is the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah. So each culture had a different way of recognizing a new beginning of a new year. And we can do that at any given time, at any moment in any time. It can be new, the beginning. This is kind of, in New Testament terminology, this is the being born again. This is the new beginning. This is when we cast off the old, when we begin the new, and we have a new clarity perhaps, and a new intention, and a new cycle of growth that begins. Now, of course, here on planet Earth, we typically think of a year as approximately 365 and a quarter days, and it is a time where we mark that the Earth has completely orbited the sun once again. And it seems, and it only seems, that the Earth is in the same position that it was at this time last year. The sun is at the same height over the horizon. The stars appear to be in the same position at night as they were a year ago. And from our limited human view, we think we're back where we were. And as I mentioned within the last couple of weeks, we're not back where we were at all. We are in a totally different place, because the very sun that the Earth has been orbiting has moved through the galaxy. And the galaxy that the sun is in is itself moving in the universe. And we don't know, our intellectual capacity to reason doesn't give us the ability to observe other universes, but we speculate, our scientists speculate, that there are many universes in the multiverse. So for all we know, the universe itself may be in motion. And that boggles our mind. How can that, which to our mind, how can that be, which is all that there is, how can that be in motion? But it is, or it may be at least. So we are not in the same place that we were a year ago physically. It seems that we are. It seems that we have completed another year. We're another year older. The paint on the walls is another year older. The car is another year older. All those things tell us that we have just completed a cycle. But if we stop and contemplate the deeper meaning, we are physically in a much different place than we were last year. But we have to open our minds. We have to open our experience and our awareness to something that really goes beyond our ability to grasp with the intellect. I mean, I can tell you, and the scientists can tell you, and they can get on TV and have a show and tell you that all of this is in motion, and all of this is much bigger than we realize, and all of this that seems to be solid is not really solid, but it is things that are coming from energy into matter and back into energy. But we don't really understand that, We don't really intellectually get that. I can tell you that there's more space in our hand than there is matter. And then in fact, there are some things that can pass straight through it without us even knowing it. And we can go, but we don't really get that. We don't really understand that. But nevertheless, it is so. It is something we have to let go of our old limiting black and white ideas, and we have to allow ourselves to expand to a greater vision. And when we consider our spiritual growth, when we consider where have we come in terms of our spiritual growth in this last year? It is kind of the same idea. It may seem that we're in the same place that we were a year ago. Physically, we're in the same place that we were a year ago. And spiritually, we may think that we are in the same place that we were a year ago. But we're not. We are constantly expanding that within us which goes beyond the intellect. See, intellectually, we may be relatively close to where we were a year ago. We may have changed a few ideas along the way, but we are more than the intellect. See? We are much more than the intellect. And there are things that can be known only through experience. So we tend to think of knowing as being an intellectual exercise. I know it because my mind can reason with it. I know it because I can write it down on a piece of paper. I know it because I can read it or I can say it. I know it because it makes sense. That's kind of perhaps the biggest thing that you'll hear in our society is somebody says, well, that doesn't make sense. And it's like, it's as if it just made sense, well, then it must be so. And we recognize then in our own lives, in our own experience, that just because something makes sense doesn't mean that it is so or that it is true or that it is real. And in fact, two people can look at the same set of circumstances and they can come away with a totally different interpretation that makes sense to them. And this experience of God that we talk about, this awareness of the presence of God, this awareness of the activity of God within us and what God is more an experiential knowing than an intellectual knowing. So if we want to ask ourselves, have I grown spiritually in the last year, we must contemplate not only have my ideas of God changed, because we're always going to be expanding into that which is without end, or the world without end, the eternal. We're always going to be discovering more of what it is, but not only at the intellectual level, but the experiential level. Have I experienced more of God in my life this last year than in the previous year? And do I wish going forward as we count this new beginning, do I wish to experience more of God still? Do I wish to open my heart and open my consciousness to allowing that omnipresence that is not only here but is everywhere, to allow it to make itself known to me through experience, through the intellect, to a greater degree. So as we come together then, this beginning of the new year, which is typically a time of resolution, where we think about changing old habits and throwing off old ideas and making room for new ideas to come into our life. What we want to do is we want to consider what that means to us in terms of our spiritual growth. What is it that we want to be? Not to do necessarily, not to have necessarily, but what is it that we want to be at the end of this year that maybe we are not right now? So in order to do that, we have to kind of, take a bearing, if you will. We have to kind of look at where we are. We want to look at how far we've come. We want to look at where we want to go. We want to kind of get an opportunity to go back and revisit some old ideas and to ask ourselves if they fit any longer. To ask ourselves if it's time to update some of the things that we believe. To kind of, as in biblical terms, to roll up the scroll and cast it in the fire. In that culture, things were written down on scrolls. Of course, they didn't have leaf paper as we know it. And because the scriptures were sacred, they didn't keep the old ones around. They would copy meticulously to a new scroll, and then they would take the old scroll and they would burn it in the fire. So they only ever kept one. So this idea of rolling up the old ideas like an old scroll and throwing them in the fire, are we ready to let go of some old limiting beliefs, and are we ready to move forward? So this is why in religious science churches, religious science teaching centers, the organizations all around the world, that it has been a tradition for many, many years that every January we go back to the basics. And what that means is we re-examine the first 4 chapters of the textbook, because it is really in the first 4 chapters of the Science of Mind textbooks that Dr. Holmes lays out the foundation of the teaching that is known as Science of Mind. And the organizations that teach it, by the way, were known as Religious Science and now are known as Centers for Spiritual Living. But the teaching is known as Science of Mind. And in the first 4 chapters of the Science of Mind textbook, Dr. Holmes pretty much lays out the foundation. And you can consider then that everything that comes after is a way of expanding or explaining or adding to the fundamental ideas in the first 4 chapters. And that's why we come back and we look at them. And the first chapter is the thing itself. And it really, what it means to me is, what is your concept of God? Now you notice that Dr. Holmes calls it the thing. What is the thing itself? He doesn't say God. He doesn't use that word, in the title at least. What is this thing itself, and why would he call it a thing? And the reason that I believe he does that is that it causes us to stop and think about what we are thinking about. So when we use the word God, if we do a Sunday talk and use the word God on a Sunday, if there are hundreds of people who hear that word, there are hundreds of different ideas of what that means. Hundreds of different interpretations as to what God is and what that means. Now, people didn't always realize that. I mean, the Apostles' Creed, if you go back into the history of Christianity, the Apostles' Creed was put in place as a way of weeding out those terrible Gnostics, the people who had a different idea of what God was than the orthodox or the fundamental idea of what God was. So the Apostles' Creed was put in place because the people at the time believed that if everybody had to stand together side by side and say, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, that they would be able to somehow detect the people who did not believe in the same God that they believed in. And of course that was just frivolous. Everybody standing side by side saying, I believe in God, has a different concept and a different idea of God. See, the word God is not God. The word God is just an audible symbol of an idea that we hold as to what God is, what God may be. But even our idea of what God is and what God might be is not God. It is simply our idea of what God is and what God might be. And our idea, our mental capacity to understand what God is not that great. I want you to kind of, if you will, I want you to think about a time and a place. Perhaps it would be the night sky would be a great example of it. If you can imagine yourself somewhere where there are no street lights to distract or to distort the night sky, but some place where you are in nature at night and it is clear and you can see forever. It seems like forever. For Lori and I, many years ago, we went up to the mountains of Colorado through Christmas and New Year's. We took a vacation with the kids up there. And one of the activities we went on was they took us on a midnight sleigh ride. And we went to Fraser, Colorado. And Fraser, Colorado was known as the icebox of the nation until International Falls sued them for the right to the name. But it's called the icebox of the country for a good reason. It was cold. Believe me, it was cold. I don't know how the horses that were pulling the sled could even stand it, because everybody on the sled was covered up under these heavy blankets, and we were all dressed in our winter clothes, and it didn't matter. It was cold. In fact, at one point they took us to a little clearing and they started a huge fire and gave us hot chocolate, and everybody looked like they were a chicken on a barbecue spit. We just kept turning around and around and around, because you'd stand and face the fire, and your front would be warm, but your back would be cold, and then you would spin around and you would just keep rotating to try to keep yourself warm all over. But while we were out there on this sleigh ride and we were able to look up, we were far enough away from the little towns that the lights, the street lights from the towns didn't distort the night sky. And it was just absolutely incredible how clear the sky was. And I want you to think about a time in your life that you may have been in a place like that, and just the feeling of awe that comes over you, as you look out and you realize, my God, how magnificent, how grand, how large is this universe? How far does it go? How far can my eyes actually perceive the light that is out there? And some of the little dots of light that I'm looking at appear as a tiny dot to me, but under a telescope, they're an entire galaxy. And they are millions of light years away. It took the light millions of years to get there to my eye. How grand is this? How wonderful is this? How large is this? And in our contemplating this, as I invite you to go back to that feeling, can you feel it with awe, with wonder, with a sense of grandeur, but completely without fear? We're not afraid of the universe, or at least we probably shouldn't be afraid of the universe. I mean, stop and think about how secure you feel when you get up out of bed in the morning and you put your feet on the ground and you start walking, and now you suddenly realize that that ground that you're walking on is just a tiny speck of dust in this vast, vast universe. And it is so much more. It is so much more than what we realize through our limited experience here on earth. But if we will take the time, to be with it, to sit with it, to contemplate it, to just experience it, we can come to the realization that it is so much greater than any idea of it that we have ever had. And as we stay with it, we can recognize then that we are part of it. This is the most important. We are part of it. We are not an accident of it. We are not a byproduct of it. We are an integral part of it. We are in fact the very point in consciousness that comes to recognize and realize and experience all of this grandeur. You can say that you and I then are the point where the universe itself, where God itself, by whatever concept of it we have, where it comes to appreciate itself, where it comes to realize its own magnificence, to realize its own beauty, to realize its own goodness through us. It is through us that it experiences all of this. And when we come to think about God, whatever God is to us, whether we call it love or spirit or nature or first cause or principle, we want to kind of take that same attitude towards it. And that is, Dr. Holmes tells us, we don't want to approach it in fear. So much of traditional religion is about fear, about being afraid that God is going to cast us into hell for eternity if we don't behave appropriately. And we have to come to recognize that it couldn't do that because it couldn't put part of itself away in torment for eternity. We have to come to realize that whatever we are is some part of it because it has created us out of itself. It had nothing else to work with when it made all that we see and all that we can't see. It had nothing else to work with but itself. So we have to come and stand in awe at what God as us is. Right? This is the Christ that we talked about at Christmas. The point where the human and the divine meet. That is you and I. That is all persons. Can we be in awe of that without being afraid of that? Can we just simply accept that we are part of it and a very important part and a very integral part of it? And can we learn to respect and appreciate our spiritual nature and what we truly are? And this is what Dr. Holmes is telling us to consider, or inviting us to consider, in the first chapter, The Thing Itself. Now, I just want to mention for those who would like to go a little bit deeper, please, I would invite everyone, please find your copy of the textbook and read the first chapter of The Thing Itself, and read it through this week, and read it several times this week. I've read it I don't know how many times over the last 20 or 25 years, and every time that I read it, I get something different out of it. But I invite you to go back and, if you can, find Thomas Troward's The Creative Principle in the Individual, or The Creative Process in the Individual is the name of his book. Troward was an English judge. He was born in England, and he was raised in the Church of England. And in fact, he never felt that he was anything other than the Church of England. But he became known as a great teacher in New Thought. And Troward went off to India, where he served as a civil judge in India for about 25 years. And while he was in India, he started to become acquainted with the ideas of the Eastern thought, of the Hindu and the Buddhist thought. And instead of labeling things as different, and wrong, which is typically what people do when they come in contact with another religion, right, or another way of thinking. Well, my way is right and your way is wrong. Troward was able to blend them together. He was able to see how essentially the different cultures were trying to say the same things in different ways. Or as Joseph Campbell might tell us, that what mythology does is mythology puts the local costume onto the ideas, the universal principles that are trying to express. Thich Nhat Hanh wrote an interesting book about Jesus and Buddha, and he compares the life and teachings of the two and shows how they are more alike than they are different. So Troward is typically considered in what we call New Thought as the point where East meets West. And Troward wrote his findings, wrote his ideas down. He was very well received and well respected in England. In fact, one of the bishops of the Church of England used to preach from Troward's writings. So he was so universally recognized that the Christian community could read his works and say, this is the essence of what Christianity is. And other people could read his works and they would say, this is the essence of what we believe as well. But Troward was a little bit hard to understand, because most of his work was transcribed from lectures, and in many cases the sentence is the entire paragraph with 10 or 12 semicolons thrown in there. So it's very difficult to interpret. But Dr. Holmes was very widely read. He read New Testament. He read Old Testament. He read from the Hindu. He read from the philosophers, and he started to adopt and his own understanding of what this thing itself is, what God is. And he came across Thomas Troward, and when he read Thomas Troward, it kind of everything gelled for him, everything acquiesced for him. He had read Emerson and understood Emerson. He said reading Emerson was like taking a drink of cool water. It was refreshing, and it let him know that there were other people in the world who thought like he thought. And when he found the writings of Thomas Troward, he felt that he finally had all the little bits and pieces to his personal understanding of God put together. Because what Troward did was Troward explained in this book, The Creative Process in the Individual, he explained the problem of evil. Now, the problem of evil, if you look at any theologians or philosophers, the problem of evil simply boils down to this. If there is this thing called God, which is all good and all kind and all loving, then how do you explain the bad things that happen here on earth? How do you explain the wars, and how do you explain the hatred, and how do you explain the sickness, and how do you explain the disease? And that is the question that becomes known as the problem of evil. And if you look at different religions and philosophies, and you look at the way that they explain this problem of evil, you will kind of get the essence of what they're teaching. Right? So traditional theology explains the problem of evil through the fall of man, that God didn't make us to be this way, but we chose to be disobedient, and because we chose to be disobedient, we therefore invited all manners of punishment and calamity to us, and that God sends us these things in order to punish us or to teach us a lesson. That is kind of the essence of what you will get in the traditional Christian theology of the world. But Troward didn't see it that way. Troward saw more of a mechanical process, if you want to call it that, a process of law unfolding. And let me just say before I go on to that not every culture sees the problem of evil in that light. In fact, Christianity as we have it today claims Judaism as its roots. And in fact, you'll hear people say, Judeo-Christian, as if it was one word. And it's not. It's not the same. In the Old Testament theology, this concept of a devil as a power of evil, that comes and tempts people and gets them to do bad things, it wasn't there. It wasn't there in Old Testament theology. In fact, this entire concept of Satan and the devil that we have in the modern world is something that evolved in what they call the intertestament times, in between when the Old Testament kind of ended and the New Testament began. There was this evolution of ideas, and it kind of began with the Babylonian captivity. The Jewish people were carried off to Persia, to Babylon, and there they became exposed to the ideas of Zoroastrianism, which included a prince of light and a prince of darkness, which later became the person of Jesus and the person of the devil, or the person of Satan. But that idea didn't exist in Old Testament theology up until that time, you see. So not everybody believed in this power of evil, this seducer that was luring people away from the will of God, from the desires of God, and therefore causing people to invoke the wrath of God and the punishment of God, the fear of God. And certainly in the ideas of Thomas Troward, he didn't see it that way either. And what Troward saw was that we live in a spiritual universe, and by spiritual, and Dr. Holmes defines this for us in the textbook, the world of conscious awareness, the world of mind. We live in a spiritual universe that responds to us according to our belief. It is just that simple. If you go back and you look at the different teachings, if you look at Judaism in the Old Testament, it says, as you think and believe in your heart, so are you. I think that's Proverbs 23:7. As you think and believe in your heart, so you are. In the New Testament, we're told when you pray believing in your heart that it is done and it shall be done. In Buddhism, we're told that everything that we have experienced is a result of what we have thought. And in the Stoic philosophies of the Greeks and the Romans, they kind of shared this philosophy. We were told that what the mind can conceive and believe, the mind can achieve. And of course, Dr. Holmes brought that up to date and just simply said, change your thinking, change your life. What Troward laid out and what Holmes grabbed onto was this idea that We do not live in a universe that we need to be afraid of. We do not exist within a God that we need to be afraid of, because it is not punishing us. It is not condemning us. It is not sending us sickness or disease as punishment or tests, but rather we live in a universe in which the experience that we have is unfolding based on our belief. It is literally done unto us according to our belief. And when Dr. Holmes got that idea, it just kind of made everything gel for him. It just brought everything together. It's kind of put the problem of evil into a context that he could understand. And it removed the fear. It removed the doubt. There's no reason to be afraid of that which has created us out of itself. There is no reason to believe that it could punish us by sending us to a place of torment forever and ever, because it couldn't send itself there. But we, because we have the ability to choose, we can do that to ourselves. We can put ourselves in a place of torment. We can put ourselves in a place of mental anguish and suffering until we begin anew, until we change our thinking, until we change our view of the world. So what Dr. Holmes asks us to consider, and what I invite you to consider as we go through this chapter, now we're going to go through the first 4 chapters in this month, and there's a lot of overlap naturally between the chapters. We'll be hitting on some of these ideas several times. But what he asks us to consider, the essence of this is very important, that in order for us to be individualized, in order for us to be truly a unique individual, we had to have free will. We have to have the ability to choose, and we have to have the ability to experience the consequences of our decisions, of our choices, even to temporarily bring into our lives pain and suffering and calamities of all sort. But Dr. Holmes tells us to create us as an individual without giving us freedom of choice is an impossibility. Think about that. We have computers, and the computers have a software program that runs them, and they are not individualized. They might be a one-of expression. Each computer that we have on our desktop may be a different expression than the other ones, but they all have the same operating system. And they all essentially, they cannot choose. They may be customizable, but they cannot choose. And I know that if your computer is ever giving you trouble, you're saying, well, wait a second, mine's possessed by demons. But it just seems that way. But you and I can choose. We truly have freedom of will. We can truly choose. We are not little robots. We are not little software programs running on a computer. We are unique, individualized expressions of the divine life. So in order for us to be an individual and to have a complete range of choice, the divine had to create us with the possibility that we would use that power in a manner that would seem like bondage, seem like suffering. But Dr. Holmes tells us that bondage is not God ordained, that the divine did not create us with the intention of us being in pain and suffering, but they are simply consequences of the way that we have misused the very power that is part of our nature. That is, that we have misused through ignorance the very power that would set us free. So Dr. Holmes tells us that our destiny, that because God is perfect freedom, and because we are created of it, that our destiny is one of perfect freedom. And that the experiences to the contrary are temporary experiences that must eventually be let go of, that must eventually go away. So the first thing we want to consider is that we need not be in fear, but we should be in awe at the magnificence of what the divine is, and we must be in awe of the magnificence of what the divine as us is. Not because we of ourselves are so great. You know, the Bible tells us, of my own self I can do nothing. But we are to be in awe of what God as us is, what God as us can do. And then we come to recognize that the essence of everything is what we call consciousness or mind, conscious awareness. That God is conscious, that the thing itself is conscious, that the thing itself is aware. And that this consciousness seems to operate at two levels. Now, we just put it into two because it makes it easier for us to understand. In fact, we eventually put it into three, the Trinity, which exists in many cultures and many religions. But there is the consciousness that we are aware of, and there is the consciousness that falls below our level of awareness. Dr. Holmes calls one objective and the other subjective. In modern times, we might call it the conscious and the subconscious. And it's a little bit misleading because the subconscious is still conscious. It is just not functioning at our level of awareness. We went through a long discussion in one of our classes one time, and we finally decided that subliminal was a better definition. But there is that level of the mind that is aware, and it is aware that it is aware, and it thinks, and it chooses, and it decides. And then there is a level of mind that is subjective to that conscious awareness. In other words, the conscious awareness can choose, and it can turn that decision over to the subjective mind, the subconscious mind, and the subconscious mind must act. It must follow the direction that it has been giving. It doesn't make choices on its own in terms of to change what it is that the conscious mind has decided it wants. The easiest example is you go out, you take a tomato seed and you put it in your garden, and the soil produces a tomato plant. The soil does not have the ability to say, well, you don't need tomatoes, you need cucumbers, I'm going to give you cucumbers instead. Now the soil and the intelligence in the seed, the chemicals, the reaction, all of those things function at a level of intelligence that were able to produce the tomato plant. So the subconscious mind then functions at a level of intelligence to follow the direction that it has been given through the belief, through the choice of the conscious mind. And it produces in our environment the appropriate result. That is very, very much the essence of the thing itself. Conscious awareness, intelligence functioning intelligently, as Dr. Raymond Charles Barker put it. And of course, the interesting thing is that we as human beings can do something it cannot. We can use this intelligence in an unintelligent manner. We can use it to bring ourselves pain. We can use it to bring ourselves suffering. So what our growth is then for the year, what excuse me, what we want to consider is that we are to experience more of that. Dr. Holmes tells us we don't need to know anymore. We don't need a bigger mind. We don't need a higher IQ. We don't need more brain. What we need to do is apply what we already know. Because the way that we will know God is not through an intellectual exercise. It is not through a teacher's idea of what God is. It is not through what you will read in a book about what God is. It is through your personal experience of what God is by learning how to cooperate with the way that God works. And what this means is to become consciously aware of what we're choosing, and to become consciously aware of the experiences in our lives. And if we are experiencing something we don't want to experience, to change what we believe about that. If we are experiencing lack, to change our ideas to ideas of plenty. So as we roll these ideas around the first 4 weeks of the year, as we kind of go back to the basics, please go back and and read the first chapter of the textbook. If you can, read Thomas Troward's Creative Process in the Individual. I'm sure it's in the public domain by now. If you search the internet for Thomas Troward Creative Process PDF, you'll probably pop up a link for it. And ask yourself, well, what do you believe about God? What do you know about God from experience? Is your concept of God still the same as it was when you were 5 years old? Kind of the Santa Claus concept of God, perhaps? Old man with a white beard up in the sky, keeping track of everything you're doing. Going to send you gifts, or going to send you punishment. That's where most of the world is. Can we come to realize that everything that we see in the world around us is people expressing their lives according to their concept of God? Even those people in the Middle East who are doing terrible things are doing it in accordance with their concept of God. And can we recognize then that everything that we express in our own lives and everything that we experience in our own lives is a direct outpicturing of our individualized consciousness of God? And is this a year of growth for us? Is this a year of us being willing to pay attention to what our ideas of God must be by the way that they are manifesting in our lives? And is this going to be a year when we are willing to go in and find out if we have any old, outdated ideas and get rid of them? And to allow ourselves to stand in awe and wonder and to feel that magnificence at the very center of our being. Now, reading and studying and listening to talks are all very good things to help move us along. But as Dr. Holmes tells us, we have to apply. We have to start where we are with what we know right now, and we have to start to apply. We have to start to use. And if we've been using it, we have to use it more. A little more every day. A little more conscious awareness, mindfulness. A little more realization that where we go, the very love of God goes. And that we are not just human. If we sit in the night and we look out at the vastness of the stars, we must recognize that we are not just a victim of this universe riding around on a tiny speck of dust, whirling about a nuclear furnace, but that we are an integral part of it. And as we go about our daily routine of loving and caring for one another, of doing our tasks at hand, of accomplishing the things in the day that need to be accomplished in the day, can we do so in full awareness that the presence of God is here as us, doing these things with us? Can we recognize as we take a bite of food that it is the very presence of God, the thing itself, showing up in our lives as food? That the food is already one with our bodies, or our bodies wouldn't know how to digest it. Can we do these things in a manner that allows us to experience more? Experience more of the thing itself. We have all been given this opportunity then to come together this year to recommit ourselves to the very, very most important thing in our lives. Everything else pales in comparison, and that is our experience of God. I invite you then, take time this week. Ask yourself, what is it that you believe to be true of God? Review the first chapter of the textbook. Find Thomas Troward and read Thomas Troward. Take some time to go somewhere and be quiet. And stop thinking. And listen. The omniscience is right where you are. The omnipotence is right where you are. Let it teach you. Let it lead you. Let it unfold through you. For that is why you have been created. It is a wonderful journey. And so it is.